I'm here in the RIBA with the famous Indian architect Charles Correa with his lifetime work. And he has just gifted this to the RIBA. It's wonderful to have you here, Charles, and you are so welcome.
Yes.
You have gifted us with 6,000 items, whether it be drawings or models or items from your wonderful lifetime's work. Tell me, it's just so important to have a full archive of your work and to digitize it. And I know that digitizing it is so important to you.
Yes.
Why is that for you?
Well, because I didn't want the drawings, frankly, to leave India, because I think that's where the work is and that's where students would be interested. But unfortunately, we don't have the facilities in India. And then, so we tried, but they don't exist. And if they exist, they're in very bad condition, some government thing somewhere. So then, if they are to go outside India, the best place was the RIBA. I knew that. And London was the best city for discussions. But I knew we had to have a record. So we started digitizing the drawings, and that led to digitizing the photographs, and then then the whole thing evolved,
Well, it's not often that we actually get a gift to the RIBA that is so magnificent, intact, and already digitized for us. So thank you very much for that. And it'll be great for future generations to actually study the work. And the fact that it's digitized means it can be seen anywhere around the world.
That's right.
Now, when you started in practice in 1958 in India, what was it like setting up? What was it like then?
Back then, you know, India was a fresh country, and there was this wonderful feeling that everything was going to change and that we'd have a new kind of life, and that's why they did Chandigarh. The idea was, in fact, I think Corbusier was told by Nehru, by the Prime Minister, don't look at the past. I want you to build a city of the future. That sounds incredibly naive today, but I think it's wonderful. Because when a country is brand new, like South Africa was in the last decade, there's that wonderful moment where there's so much hope and everything is so fragile. You know, and you have to, at that moment, risk all, I think.
You've got a great selection of cultural buildings, and I want to talk about the JKK Centre in particular, and where the inspiration of the grid of 9 came from.
Well, that comes from the city itself. The city is based on the 9 squares mandala, which was the mandala of the 9 planets. And the ruler who built the city was obsessed with the sky. So on one side, he used the oldest myths of the sky, which is the Navgraha, the 9 planets. And then he also is the one who built the newest myths, which is science. Science today, that means those astronomical instruments, you know, the triangular ones and stuff, which were way ahead of their time. You measured very precisely the movement of the sun and the stars because the instruments were made of masonry and fixed. So otherwise metal instruments could move with a tremor of the earth or something. So he had these 2 different takes on the sky, and he brought them together in the city. And since this is a memorial to the Nehru, our first Prime Minister, I thought nothing better than to bring back the city and this thing of looking, you know, Nehru wrote a book called The Discovery of India, which was looking backwards into what India was about. It's a wonderful book. But he also commissioned Corbusier to invent a new future. Now, how do you bring those 2 visions together?
Yeah.
So that from that frisson, which I said, we must use that, you know.
When you're working on all of your projects, they have a wonderful human scale to them. It's not like iconic, look at me architecture, yet it is iconic in the way that you have done it. Tell me a little bit about those recurring themes like the ritualistic pathway through your buildings or the empty centre. Where they come from?
Well, the empty centre comes really from the courtyard house, from anything you want. But to get back to what you just said, the reason the buildings might look more human is that I feel architecture is sculpture, but it is sculpture used by human beings. So it needs doors and windows, it needs place for light and air. And those openings don't spoil the sculpture, they make it complete. Now, they also give scale to that abstraction. If you just make an abstraction, it's not architecture, to my mind. It has to be a way of, so just by expressing how people use, those gestures are very, very important. And that automatically gives a kind of different look to architecture as opposed to sculpture.
And talking of scale, actually, you've worked on some small projects,
Yes.
but also some very large urban planning
Yes,
projects.
yes.
And tell us about your thoughts on the city like Mumbai, now and in the future, how you see it going.
Well, I don't know where Bombay is going because it's getting huge, bigger and bigger. But I think our cities are wonderful because they are, I mean, I don't mean they're wonderful right now, but they have a wonderful potential for changing India in the right way. I mean, they're places of where the skills we need, you know, to develop the country, doctors, nurses, lawyers. And then also they're engines of economic growth, like Hong Kong, Bombay is. And thirdly, they're places of hope for the have-nots. So for these three things, I think they're going to change India. They're wonderful, yeah.
And when you design for everybody, yet there is this rich divide in any city of rich and poor.
Oh, yes.
How do you address that in, say, your housing projects?
Well, there are two kinds. One is where you use brick and stuff, and that's, you may call it low cost, but it's still middle-class housing. There's a whole, India's like a big iceberg, a pyramid, and about 60% are squatters right now in Bombay, and the lower half of those people couldn't afford brick, and so it's more a question of open to sky space. You know, like if I have a room and I have a courtyard or a terrace, I have two rooms. So how do you get patterns in which people can use open space and colonize it, which is the traditional way a village grows up.
I love your housing designs, whether they be the low-rise or your high-rise, because they're sustainable.
Yeah.
And what do you think about those people that are building next door to you that are like the glass skyscraper, which are totally unsustainable?
Well, I prefer not to think of them, but it seems to me that it used to be that the building was shaped. It used to be, meaning I'm talking about thousands of years of history. Igloos look like igloos and something else looks like something else because of the way climate works on human beings. And the architect's imagination was to try and deal with that through the shape of the building. Mm-hmm. Right now I just make a dumb building of glass, and then by choosing low E glass, I get some LEEDs certification. It's because the mechanical engineer steps in and solves all my problems. And that's been going on for at least 30 or 40 years. And that's very bad because he denies me my imagination. If there weren't mechanical engineers, I'm not blaming them, it's our fault. Yeah, we would have to use our own ingenuity to see that the hot air and the cold air, whatever we wanted to do. Right.
You were speaking about the architecture and sculpture, and you very much work with artists, and you can see art throughout your buildings, like architecture as a metaphor, like the Big Bang or the Black Hole. And you've worked with many artists. Yes. And your wife Monica is also a fantastic artist. Yes. Do you ever work together?
No, we haven't actually.
Not yet.
I've never, no, other architects commission her, but I haven't. Yes, maybe I should do that.
But you have worked very much with many great
very
architects.
much, and I learned a lot through Monica's weaving and stuff. I learned, weaving is a lot like architecture. It's structured. Yes, and I worked with many artists. There were people like Howard Hodgkin, who did the British Council. And when I say work with them, I mean I don't just say this is your space. We try and use the painting to correct the architecture, or use the architecture to modify the painting. So the British Council, the whole facade steps back, so his shadow of a tree becomes extremely complex.
It's beautiful building, and the three spaces, and wherever you view them from, you can see the art and architecture as a whole.
And I've also worked with, at the other extreme, with traditional artists, like in JKK. Yes. Those are all Rajasthani artists doing absolutely conventional, beautiful images which exist in their minds and in history, and they recreate them. And then in between, I worked with the people who do these cinema posters in a hotel in Goa, because they can do things very fast, you know, and it's wonderful the way it modifies the space.
One thing I have to ask you about is Jane Drew, who you've come across many. Tell me the Jane Drew story.
Oh, well, there's no story. I mean, Jane Drew was one of the architects of Chandigarh, and one of the first things, one of the things I entered was a competition for low-cost housing, and it specified some apartments. And I hated the idea, so I just developed this tube house, which is very narrow, and it works, and the whole thing works like a machine for living. The hot air gets out, etc. You got some louvers. And we sent it off. And she was on the jury, and she liked it, and she just, it must have rolled over everyone else. And gave it the first prize, and came to Bombay, and I didn't know her, and she went to a friend's office, and she said, Pilu, do you know Charles Correa? Call him over.
Yeah.
And then that's why I knew I'd won. But it was very nice that she stuck her neck out, because at that time it was quite an outlandish thing to do. Anyway.
That's fantastic. She's a great hero of ours.
She's wonderful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And finally, I wanted to ask you one question on the future students. What advice would you give to the students of the future?
I would think the thing about architecture is that you can't teach it. You can learn it, but you can't teach it. And a good school is a school which makes you passionate about architecture and tells you and teaches you how to ask questions. Because the school doesn't know where you will work, what your clients will be, etc. But if you might be working in the Gulf, you might be working back in London, you might be working in India, China. But if you know how to ask the right questions, you will develop your own philosophy and your own visual vocabulary. That's the best advice I can give. And I know that I learned principles. I studied at Michigan, at MIT. Luckily, and of course I learned the tricks of the trade, but luckily it never impressed me. And what was nice was the principles. When I went back to India, I had no problem actually, frankly, adjusting whatsoever. Everyone asked me that.
Yeah.
But I've never designed a glass building. I never felt the need to. Of course I've used glass, but I wouldn't say I've ever designed a glass star. I would be so stupid as to do that.
Well, isn't it fantastic that you did stick to those principles, and you've got your life's work here, over 150 projects, and it's now in the heart of the RIBA.
Okay,
and you've added to us at the RIBA to be the leading cultural centre. So thank you so much for that gift.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the exhibition you've put up. I mean that.
That's great.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. Anytime here at the RIBA.
Thank you.
Thanks.